All right, this ought to be a good one. 2024 Clemson Tigers football preview and a game-by-game prediction coming up at the end. I'm going to put the schedule up on the screen right here, and I'm going to go through it game by game and give you a winner or loser for every single week. Before we get to that, though, I'll run through a little bit of a preview of this year's Clemson team. This video has been requested a lot in the comment section since I started doing this series of videos a little over a week ago. But shout out to Isaiah B and Tiger Paw Craven over on the Uncle Lou Patreon page. They both asked me to do this Clemson preview. So here we is. Isaiah and Tiger Paw, I really appreciate y'all supporting the show and the channel over on the Uncle Lou Patreon page. It really means a lot to me. If you want me to do your team, go over to the Patreon page, leave a comment there. Let me know what team you want me to do a preview and a prediction for. There's a link in the description of this video that'll take you over to the Patreon page. It's the first link, or it's the first post over on the Patreon page. But every day when I get ready to do these videos, I sit down. First thing I do, I pull up my Patreon page, I scroll through there, and I pick a suggestion from there. So make sure you head over there and let me know what team it is you want to see me do. Truth in advertising. Georgia's my favorite team. I'm a college football fan, but Georgia is my favorite team. At least I don't try to hide it like a lot of people do. But if for some reason you think that taints everything I'm about to say, well, okay. Whatever. And of course, Clemson does play Georgia this year, so I will be talking about that game along with all the others. But let's take a look at Clemson here. How'd they finish up last year? Well, 9-4, 8-4 in the regular season, 4-4 in ACC play, tied for 6th in the ACC. Staggering fall for Clemson really over the last 4 or 5 years. I'm going to talk more about that as we go on through this video here, but they tied for 6th in the ACC with Duke and North Carolina. I know Duke beat Clemson, so you might be thinking Duke would be ahead of them, but it was, Duke beat Clemson, Clemson beat North Carolina beat Duke, so it was a three-way tie there for 6th place. 8-4 in the regular season. They picked up their 9th win in the Gator Bowl, a great game, close game over SEC opponent Kentucky. Let's take a look at their 4 losses. Of course, there was the week 1 loss. I think we all kind of remember that. Everybody watched that game. I believe it was the Labor Day game, the Monday night game. So it was the only game on, if I remember right. So a lot of people watched it. And Duke blew them out. There's no other way to describe it. Now, you can run through the list of excuses that all the Clemson fans gave when the game ended. If we would have turned the ball over here, if we wouldn't have done this, well, you did do that. You got blown out 28-7. They then lost to Florida State. They lost on the road at Miami, and they lost on the road at NC State. Those were their 4 losses, all conference losses. Now, a lot of Clemson fans and a lot of other people have said, well, if you look at their losses, other than the Duke game, they were all winnable games. They were all really close. And to a certain extent, that's true. There was the great overtime game against Florida State. Florida State ends up winning in overtime 31-24, so a 1-possession game. On the road at Miami, another overtime game. This is an inexcusable loss, by the way. But they lost 28-20 on the road at Miami. And look, at Miami, there's no home field advantage there. There was 9 people at that game. But they, 1-possession game, 28-20. And then on the road at NC State, 24-17, a 1-possession loss. So 3 of their 4 losses were close. That is true. And this is something you hear a lot when a team has a down year and some of their wins were within a touchdown or less. It'll be a popular talking point over the course of the next offseason. Well, yeah, we lost 4 games, but, 3 of them could have gone either way type of deal. Okay. Well, what about your 5-point win over Wake Forest? This is what and this isn't anything against Clemson or Clemson fans. Everybody does this. People love to point out close losses when making an argument that their record could have been better, but they ignore close wins. If you're going to tell me that Clemson could have been 10-2 because they almost beat Florida State, they almost beat Miami, they almost beat NC State, whatever, well, then I'm going to tell you, you could have been 6-6 because you only beat Wake Forest by 5, you only beat Notre Dame by 8, you only beat Kentucky by 3. So yeah, 3 of your losses were by 1 possession or less. 3 of your wins were by 1 possession or more. These kinds of things tend to even themselves out over the course of a season. Clemson was a 4-loss team. That's it. End of story. All right, let's move on from that. All right, before we move on to taking a look at this year's Clemson's team, I want to point out what I perceive to be an obvious trend, trajectory, pattern, whatever it is you want to call it, with the state of Clemson football. All right. Everybody remembers 2 national titles, Dabo Swinney, 2016, 2018. They won 2 natties, top of the world. They were a top 1 or 2 program in the country for a period of several years, right? And when you look at them now, that appears not to be the case. Not that they're a bad team. They're not. Losing 4 games is the worst they've done in a while, okay, this past season. So I'm not here to tell you they're a bad team or a bad program. But if you're looking at a program and trying to tell whether they're trending up or down, when you take a look at Clemson, it's pretty obvious. And there's a pretty clear line of demarcation, sort of a before and after that we can look at when it comes to Clemson. And I'm going to highlight that right now. NIL and the transfer portal pretty much became a thing around 2020, okay? It started to sort of bubble up a little in 2019, some lawsuits, 2020, some rules were changed, 2021, your transfer portal becomes a thing, right? Let's take a look at how Clemson has done during the NIL and transfer portal, keeping in mind that they won a national title in 2016 and 2018, okay? In the last 3 seasons, the 21, the 22, and the 23 seasons, Clemson has failed to make the playoffs, and they have made 1 New Year's 6 game. 1. And they lost that game. An Orange Bowl loss to Tennessee. The other 2 years, like it was the Gator Bowl and the Cheez-It Bowl. Compare that to where Clemson was at from like 2015 to 2020. Playoffs and New Year's 6 every single year, okay? Let's take a look at the number of games Clemson has lost going back to their last national title in 2018. They lost 0 games in 2018. They went 15-0. The following year, they lost 1 game. 2020, they lost 2 games. 2021, 3 games. 2022, 3 games again. 2024, 4 games. For those of you who might be a little bit slow, I'll recap that. 1 loss, 2 loss, 3 loss, 3 loss, 4 loss. That is a clear pattern, a clear trajectory, okay? This is a program that is trending in the wrong direction. That can't be argued or debated. These are the facts, okay? They have lost more games every single year going all the way back to 2018. There was 1 year where they lost 3 games 2 years in a row, but they haven't had a better season than the season before since 2018. Again, 0 losses in 18, 1 in 19, 2 in 20, 3 in 21, 3 in 22, and 4 in 23. They have gotten worse every single year since winning the national title in 2018. What happened around that time? What changed in the world of college football? NIL and transfer portal. Dabo Swinney's, and here's the thing, it's not his inability to adapt to the transfer portal or his inability to adapt to NIL. We don't know if he's got the ability to adapt to the transfer portal or not. He refuses to acknowledge. He just pretends it doesn't exist. This would be like after segregation, still refusing to use black players, even though you know it would help your team win. This is just complete insanity. And I can't understand for the life of me why there aren't more Clemson fans that are demanding answers and change from the top down at Clemson. And I don't mean firing Dabo. I mean philosophical changes to the way they look at the game of football. It is literally passing them by right in front of their eyes while they stand still. And the reality is, Clemson has not gotten a whole lot worse as a team, but too many other teams have caught up to where they're at. That is what has happened because they are using the portal. They are utilizing NIL to both entice new recruits, entice transfer players, and to entice existing players to stick around for additional years. You might not like these rules. There's plenty of things about transfer and NIL that I don't like either. But to pretend that it doesn't exist to the detriment of your own team is insanity. It's dereliction of duty as a head coach. And I don't understand why there aren't more Clemson fans that are trying to hold Dabo's feet to the fire. Recruiting, another area where Clemson is trending in the wrong direction from NIL to now. You look at Clemson's recruiting classes from the time the transfer portal and the NIL became a thing, basically around the 2020 season. Here's their recruiting classes during that period of time. Go back to 2020, the first recruiting period before NIL. Clemson had the third ranked recruiting class in the country. The following year, 5th. The year after that, 10th. The year after that, 11th. The most recent class, 11th. Clemson has went from signing top 5 classes pre-NIL to outside of the top 10 post-NIL. This is the most obvious thing to me to look at and see, and Clemson fans are like the one-legged ostrich with their head buried in the sand, and I can't figure it out. And you can tell me I'm a hater, I hate Clemson, I hate Dabo, I hate this, I hate that. I don't hate Clemson or Dabo, okay? Georgia and Clemson used to play a lot when I was 4 and 5 years old back in the early 80s. I became a football fan in the mid to late 80s, really big in the 90s. We never played Clemson. We play them about twice a decade for the last 40 years. That's it. I've got no reason to hate Clemson or Dabo, besides the fact that Georgia absolutely owns them. Georgia's like 43-18 against. So in other words, I've got no reason to hate Clemson or Dabo, and I don't hate Clemson or Dabo. These are just facts and reality. And I don't understand how the Clemson fans can deny these things, but somehow they manage to do it. Let's take a look. We talked about the recruiting classes. The class that just finished up was 11th. Before that, 11th. Before that, 10th. Before that, 5th. Before that, 3rd. So again, they've gone from top 5 recruiting pre-NIL in the teens to can't even get a top 10 class now that NIL is a thing. An obvious downward trajectory. Is it a coincidence that their recruiting classes have gotten progressively worse since 2020 and their record has gotten progressively worse since 2020? Is that just some sort of weird coincidence? Is it also a coincidence that this all started the minute NIL and transfer portal became a thing and Dabo Swinney has spent the last 5 years pretending they don't exist? Is that all just a coincidence? They've still got a really talented team. They're one of the most top 10 talented teams in the country. Again, here's the issue. Even when Clemson was recruiting 3rd and 4th, you look at those teams that were constantly recruiting ahead of them, and then if you look at Clemson's recruiting now, and you look at the teams that are recruiting ahead of them, your Georgias, your Bamas, your Ohio States, your Texas, whatever teams you want to name that are recruiting consistently in the top 5 or top 10, which again is no longer Clemson. That was Clemson in the teens. It's not Clemson now. You've got those teams. Not only are they out recruiting Clemson every single year, which they weren't doing in the teens, they are also backfilling their holes in their roster with the transfer portal. Georgia, Bama, Ohio State, Texas, whatever these teams you want to name that recruit in the top 5 or the top 10, I'm talking high school recruiting every single year, they still go out and get players from the portal that make their team better. You look at Clemson over the last few years, they don't have an offensive line that anybody can name. I think, what do they have, like one offensive line player that's been drafted in the last 4 or 5 years? What happened to all the elite Clemson wide receivers that were getting drafted in the teens and early 20s? You can't name a Clemson wide receiver in the last 3 or 4 years. They're forgettable. They're not any good. Where's the next Trevor Lawrence? Where's the next Deshaun Watson? Jeez, y'all, it's almost to the point now Clemson would settle for a Kelly Bryant. They got this guy now, Club Dick. This guy can't throw the ball from here to there. And he throws it to the other team more than he does his own. And the Clemson fans sit around and go, well, no, it's not. It's got nothing to do with the portal. It's got nothing to do with NIL. It's got nothing to do with recruiting or Dabo or his philosophy or none of that. It's coaching. Listen, I'm lucky right now in that Georgia's one of the premier programs in college football. That was not always the case. I've been a Georgia fan for a long, long time. Believe me, I've seen a lot of bad seasons, okay? In fact, I started this channel when Georgia was a pretty run-of-the-mill type top 10. In fact, they were a lot like Clemson is now. When I started this channel, Georgia was basically what Clemson is now. They were a 9, 10, 11 win team. That's about what they were. And I was fit to be fucking tired on here. I was yelling and screaming, and we need to get rid of this coach, and we need to go recruit that player, and we need better players here, and we got to do this, and we got to do that, and this is ridiculous, and if it don't change, and then I came out and I fired, we got to fire Mark Richt. I was leading that train, and this was while Georgia was busy having seasons just like Clemson has had the last 2 or 3 years. Exactly the same. Exactly the same. Multiple 10 wins. Hell, Mark Richt got fired in a year Georgia won 10 games. I didn't give a shit. I wasn't trying to hear it. There was obvious areas in which Mark Richt was dropping the ball. Again, and I'm not suggesting that means Clemson should fire Dabo. I don't think Clemson should fire Dabo. I don't think they are. That's not at all what I'm suggesting. But what I am suggesting is that if you as a Clemson fan can't take an honest look at your program right now and realize that the problem, the number one problem, is Dabo Swinney, you're in a cult. Clemson's been accused of being a cult in the past, and that accusation might be right. If you don't have the ability to look at Clemson and see clearly what is going on in the last 4 or 5 years in the age of NIL, Dabo has come out and told you. It's like the thing, remember when Trump said, I could shoot somebody in the middle of Fifth Avenue and people would still vote for me? Maybe that's true, maybe it's not. But Dabo is telling you, as a Clemson fan, I ain't got no interest in the portal. I'm not using it. I don't believe in NIL, so I'm not really going to push that either. While we lose more games every single year than we did the year before. And he's telling you that. And you're eating it up like a pile of steaming poop. I don't understand it. Maybe that's just because that's not the type of fan I am. I'm not this, well, you got to support the team no matter what. Support the coaches no matter what. Support every player no matter what. Or you have people tell you that, I guess you can do better. That's not the fucking standard for what makes a good college football coach or a good college football program is, can they do better than Lou? That's not the fucking standard, okay? I don't understand these Clemson fans who are sitting on their hands licking the boot of Dabo Swinney when it is clear and plain as day that failure to adapt to NIL and transfer portal changes in the world of college football over the last 5 years is the direct and only reason that Clemson is currently losing 4 games a year instead of competing for national titles. That is the only reason, period. Let's move this shit along. So we talked about their recruiting classes. What about their portal classes? There ain't no portal classes. They're dead last. Every single year that there has been a transfer portal, Clemson has been dead last. And they're dead last again. There were 4 teams in the country that signed 0 transfers during this cycle. The 3 service academies, Air Force, Army, Navy, who can't take transfers, and Clemson. Congratulations. Let's look at the Vegas odds. Vegas says Clemson's winning 9.5 games this year. I know you can't win 9.5 games. This is a betting number. You're betting over or you're betting under. So you either think they're going 10-2 or better, in which case you'd bet over 9.5, or you think they're going 9-3 or worse, in which case you'd bet the under. I would redirect you to the trend and trajectory I pointed out earlier when it comes to betting on that 9.5 number. What about the Natty? They got the 14th best odds to win the Natty. That's great. Problem is only 12 teams make the playoffs. What a shame that is. That puts them in the same category with Texas A&M and Miami. So, if you're a Clemson fan and you think you got a shot at winning the Natty, well, you got just as much a shot as Texas A&M or Miami. Can you win the ACC? You got the second best odds behind Florida State. This is where Clemson fans are being propped up in their thinking. The ACC is just not any good. I don't know what you want me to tell you. What do I want to tell you? Florida State was a good team last year. Who was the second best team in the ACC? You tell me. I'm seriously asking. Was it Louisville? Because they got humiliated by the 9th best team in the SEC, Kentucky. The ACC is just not good, top to bottom. It's not. So, he's winning 9 or 10 games. In the ACC, he's winning 9 or 10 games a year. What would he fucking do? You're not going to compete or win at a high level. Is there anybody that honestly thinks if Clemson makes the playoffs this year, and remember, 12-team playoff, you got to win 3 or 4 games now in the playoffs, depending on whether you get a first round bye. Is there anybody on the face of the planet that thinks in 3 or 4 consecutive weeks at the end of the season, Clemson could beat, let's just say, Ohio State, Kansas State, Alabama, and Texas in a row. No, stop it. Not happening. But you do have the 14th best odds. ACC, second best odds behind Florida State. Miami is just behind Clemson in terms of the odds. Odds to make the playoffs. You're an underdog to even make the playoffs. Clemson's odds to make the playoffs are at plus 185. The no is at minus 215. So according to the Vegas odds anyway, there's a better chance Clemson doesn't make the playoffs than that there is. If you don't understand betting numbers, that's not the point. I'm not going to get into that here, but you'll just have to trust me that if Clemson to make the playoffs is at plus 185 and Clemson to miss the playoffs is at negative 215, that means there's a much better chance, again, according to Vegas, that they don't make the playoffs than that they do. That got me worked up here. Let's put the schedule up on the screen. I'm going to go through it game by game and give you a winner and a loser for every single week. All right, when I look at this schedule, a couple of things jump out. Obviously, I don't know what more difficult game you could draw week 1 than what you did. Georgia's ranked 1st, 2nd, or 3rd in every single preseason poll on planet Earth. They've got one of the best returning quarterbacks in all of college football. They're going to have a top 5 defense again, like they do every single year under Kirby Smart. They've brought in transfers in areas of need, which has made them even better than they otherwise would be. That's obviously a tough game there. Of course, that's bookended by the annual in-state rivalry game against South Carolina, which is at home this year for Clemson. I also noticed an App State game on here. That's a dangerous game to schedule there. App State is a team that has shown the ability to be able to beat Power 5 teams on occasion. Now, not as often as it's made out to be sometimes. The more often than not, App State loses. In fact, more often than not, App State gets blown out when they play Power 5 opponents. But they've got a couple of really signature wins over Power 5 opponents over the last 15 to 20 years. And so in a lot of people's mind, that's what they think of, and sort of not all the losses, but still a dangerous game, I think, for Clemson. They play all of the favorites to win the ACC this year. If you look at the top 4 or 5 teams, with the exception of Miami, but they play NC State, they play Florida State, they play Louisville, and they play Virginia Tech. I believe if you look at the top 6 odds to win the ACC, in no particular order, you'd have Clemson. No, they can't play themselves, right? But of the remaining top 5 teams in the ACC, you would have in that top 5 NC State, Florida State, Virginia Tech, and Louisville, and Miami. Again, in no particular order. So you play 4 of the 5 highest ranked preseason teams in the ACC, excluding yourself because you can't play yourself. So not an easy schedule by ACC standards, but a pretty easy schedule compared to a normal person's schedule. Anyway, when I look at this schedule, 4 games I don't even have to think about at all right? 3 wins that I don't see any way imaginable Clemson loses these games. Home against Stanford, one of the worst teams in the Power 5. Home against Virginia, another one of the worst teams in all of the Power 5. An ex-coach from Clemson is the head coach there. And next to the last game of the year against Citadel. Those are 3 games I see no way Clemson loses. There's only 1 game on here that I see no way they win, and that's week 1 against Georgia. The rest of the games, I'm going to go through them now for you one by one. We'll start with the Georgia game. Look, the line is already out. Georgia's a 2-touchdown favorite in this game. I think Georgia will probably beat them by more than that. A lot of people are pointing to the 2021 game and what a great game that was, and low scoring and a defensive deal and all that. That's true. You had 2 first-year starting quarterbacks in that game. You had Stetson Bennett, who had never entered the you had JT Daniels, who had first-year starter at Georgia, and you had DJ Ukulele, a first-year starter at Clemson, and that was just an odd game. And Georgia won 10-3. There was no offensive touchdowns, and that's not happening this time. Georgia's got a returning quarterback, one of the best in the country, in Carson Beck. They did lose Brock Bowers and Ladd McConkey. Ladd McConkey was the 4th leading receiver on Georgia's team last year. I'm not pointing that out to belittle McConkey or to say that he wasn't any good. Obviously he was, but he was injured a large portion of the year last year, so he was actually the 4th leading receiver. So Georgia has 2 of its 4 leading receivers from last year back. They lose Brock and McConkey. They brought a couple in from the transfer portal. They brought ETN at running back. in from Florida. They've got one of the best offensive lines in the country. I do think this will be a great matchup. Georgia's offensive line against Clemson's defensive line, because it's, sort of, as much as Clemson has fallen off in the last 4 or 5 years, they have continued to put a really good defense out on the field most of the time over the last 3, 4, 5 seasons, right? Now, I'm curious to see how long they can keep that up. Venables left a couple of years ago. I expect a little bit of a drop-off to show up each year, trailing Brent Venables leaving a couple of years ago, but they still have one of the best fronts in all of college football. So I think that'll be a key matchup in that Georgia game. Georgia's experienced veteran offensive line, one of the best in the country, against one of the best defensive fronts in the country for Clemson. But you flip it around offensively, Cade Klubnik is just a turnover machine. He just is, okay? The guy, Clemson had a turnover in every single game last year. They didn't go a single game without turning the ball over. They'll turn it over week 1 against Georgia at the most inopportune time, I'm sure, like they always do. And that'll give the Clemson man a reason to blame the loss on something other than the fact that Georgia's just way better than them, which they are. Like I mentioned before, Georgia and Clemson have played a ton of times, over 60 times. These two teams have played. Georgia's 43-18 against them all time. And I just don't think Clemson's going to have the offense to be able to move the ball up and down the field and score consistently enough on Georgia to win this game. They lost Will Shipley, who was probably their best player last year. I do like Mafe at running back, but look, in today's college football, most teams are playing 2 running backs, rotating them in and out, right? Mafe was good. How good will he be without Shipley? He'll still be good, but they're going to have to find a second guy, right? They're wide receivers. Again, no one can name any. Clemson, if you're a Clemson fan, maybe you can name 2. But other than that, there's not a person on planet Earth that knows any of the wide receivers. This is just a mismatch, and Georgia will win. That's all there is to it. App State. I can't think of a worse time for Clemson to be playing App State than right now. If they lose this game to App State, that could be devastating to Dabo, his longevity, and Clemson as a program over the next few years, because they're getting a lot of heat. Dabo in particular, for the way he's handled the transfer portal and NIL. And, he's sort of, I'm going to do it my way. It's my way or the highway. I don't care what everybody else is doing. My way worked. I mean, yeah, it worked 10 years ago. College football has changed. I don't think Clemson's going to lose this game to App State. I'm giving Clemson the win. It's a home game here. Clemson's really good at home. I think they've only lost, 1, maybe 2 home games in the last 5 or 6 years. They don't lose at home. But this is going to be App State's Super Bowl here. They're going to come in here looking for blood. And App State, they haven't beat a ton of top-tier Power 5 teams, but they play Power 5 teams every single year. They're not going to be intimidated. That's one thing they're not going to be. Some of these lower-tier teams, they come into these bigger environments, and the game is over before it ever even starts because, their eyes are this big around and their mouths are hanging open, and they're just kind of looking around at everything. App State's not going to suffer from that problem. They won't be intimidated. They won't be scared. I don't think the environment's going to get to them or anything like that. I don't see, as funny as it would be, and it would be funny, I don't see it happening. I think Clemson gets the win there. You have a bye week. Come out of your bye week, NC State. Lost to NC State last year. NC State, along with Clemson, Florida State, Miami, kind of the favorites to win the ACC this year. I like NC State's quarterback situation better than I do Clemson's, even though Clemson's got a returning starter and NC State doesn't. I like Dave Duran. He's yet to have like that breakout year where he wins 11 or 12 games, but he's pretty consistent in that 8-9 win range. And right now, I just like what they've got going on at NC State better than I do at Clemson. I think Clemson, for the second year in a row, has 2 losses before the calendar turns to October. I think you lose at home to NC State. Stanford, again, a win. One of the newcomers to the ACC out of the Pac-12, which is no longer existing, unfortunately. They're now in the ACC for no particular reason at all. Clemson will have no problem with the tree. Clemson gets a win there. On the road at Florida State, one of the best games of the year last year for Clemson and really in all of college football was that game in Clemson early in the year, or I guess about this same time in the year, maybe sort of the middle of the year. Maybe it was a little earlier. Doesn't matter. It was one of the best games in all of college football at Clemson. Game goes to overtime. Florida State ends up winning a close one. This one in Doak Campbell. Now, I don't think Florida State's going to be as good as they were last year, but they don't have to be as good as they were last year to beat Clemson. I think they've got enough at home to get the win. Clemson, in the first half of the season, catches their 3rd loss on the road at Florida State. Back-to-back road games. You got to go play Wake. One more thing about the Florida State game. There's, of course, the DJ Ukulele angle here. Now, I don't think DJ Ukulele is a great quarterback. I think he's better and more experienced than Cade Klubnik at Clemson, though. And the fact that it's a home game for Ukulele and he's got kind of a revenge factor, they sort of threw him away. Not really. But I think it's just natural as a player. If you get an opportunity to play for your former team, I just think it's kind of natural that you kind of have a little bit extra juice for that. You know, Georgia's going to face this themselves this year when they go on the road to Kentucky. Kentucky has Brock Vandagriff playing quarterback, who transferred from Georgia. DJ Ukulele, of course, transferred from Clemson to Oregon State, now down to Florida State. So that's an interesting angle to keep an eye on for the Clemson at Florida State game, which I think Florida State will win. Back-to-back road games at Wake Forest. Outside of that one decent year they had a couple of years ago, just no real concerns there. I think Clemson will win. Home against Virginia, one of the worst teams on the planet. This will be, is Elliott, is that the coach's name? He was assistant under Dabo, got the head coaching job at Virginia. Hasn't worked out. Don't think it's going to work out this year. Clemson should get that win, no problem. That takes you to your second bye week. You come out of that, and you've got 2 or 3 tough games in a row here, depending on what happens with Pitt this year. But Louisville, one of the favorites to compete to win the ACC. They, of course, made the ACC championship game last year, coming up short against that Florida State team. Jeff Brom knows what he's doing there, and they brought in a ton of transfers. Now, if you're a Clemson fan and you're watching this video, a transfer is a player that used to play for one team, but now he plays for another. He entered this thing called the portal. The portal is like a database of players who want to change teams, and existing teams that have holes on their roster, or maybe they're not as talented in certain areas as they wish they were. Teams can look in that portal, and if there are players in there that they feel like can make their team better, they can offer those players. That's what the transfer portal is. As a Clemson fan, you have no clue what that is. That's what it is. And Louisville's got a ton of them, and they've got a pretty good coach there in Brom. But I actually think Clemson wins this one at home. They're coming off a bye week, so if they've got any banged up players or injuries or anything like that, they'll get a week to sort of heal up and get ready for what I think might be one of the biggest games of the year for Clemson here, this Clemson-Louisville game at home. You got to remember, at least if I'm right, they'll already have 3 losses here. 2 of them will be ACC losses. NC State and Florida State. So they just cannot afford to take a third ACC loss here. Clemson can't. I think this is sort of a give it everything they got game here, and I think they do get the win at home against Louisville. That's the good news. The bad news, you got to turn around the following week and go on the road to Blacksburg. I don't know if this is a night game or if that's been announced. I'm looking at the schedule here, and it doesn't have a time yet for that game announced, but if it's a night game, yeah, it'll be even more difficult, but a tough place to play, a team that is trending in the opposite direction of Clemson. Clemson started here. They're trending here. Virginia Tech's been here for a while. They're trending here. They've got more returning production than anybody in the country. They were red hot at the end of last season. They won, I think, 4 or 5 of their last 6 or 7 games. And a lot of people are looking to Virginia Tech to possibly be this year's version of Louisville. In other words, sort of a team that makes the ACC title game who hadn't been there in a while. I don't know if they're at that point yet, but I do think they beat Clemson here. I think this is Virginia Tech's biggest game of the year. All of the reasons that I feel like Clemson will beat Louisville the week before, that's why the same thing I think Virginia Tech beats Clemson this week. Crazy home environment, sort of a back against the wall, must win, biggest game of the year mentality, and I think the Hokies get it done. And unfortunately for the Tater Man, that's their 4th loss, 3rd in the ACC, knocking them out of probably any ACC title hopes or playoff hopes. On the road at Pitt, I'm going to have to be proven wrong. I don't think Pitt's very good again, and I think you'll go up there and get the win. St. Citadel, we already talked about that. And South Carolina, I know it's a rivalry game, and could South Carolina beat Clemson? I guess they could. They beat them 2 years ago for no reason. Like this is just a game that, other than this being a rivalry game, I don't understand how anybody could pick South Carolina to win. I know we spent a lot of time in this video talking about some of Clemson's issues because this is a Clemson video, but South Carolina's got a ton of issues too. They're going to have a very young team, first-year starter at quarterback, a true freshman offensive lineman most likely, replacing a lot of pieces, moving a lot of pieces around, transfer portal type addition stuff. I just don't think they're anywhere near as good of a team right now as Clemson is. Now, again, it is a rivalry. I don't think South Carolina was as good as Clemson 2 years ago. They played and South Carolina won the game, though. So I get it. South Carolina could win. I don't see it happening. I'm picking Clemson to take care of business at home in that rivalry game to end the season. That puts you at 8-4, the same record as last year, at least in the regular season. Now, last year you went on to win a meaningless bowl game that nobody watched. to finish 9-4. You could lose that meaningless bowl game this year and finish 8-5, which would continue that downward trajectory, which I want to reiterate again for the umpteenth time. Clemson won the national title in 2018 at 15-0. That's 0 losses. 2019, they made the playoffs and only had 1 loss. In fact, they lost in the national title game. So they won the national title, then they lost the national title. The third year, they lost the first round of the playoffs. It's 3 years in a row heading the wrong direction. 2020, NIL comes around, transfer portal comes around. What has happened to Clemson from 2020 till now? 2020, 2 losses, lost in the first round of the playoffs. They have not made the playoffs since. 2021, 3 losses. 2022, 3 losses again. 2024, this past season. 2023, I'm sorry, 4 losses. Downward trajectory. 8-4 for Clemson in the regular season is my prediction for 2024. If they lose their bowl game, which you can't predict that now. We don't know what game it is or who they would be playing or who would be sitting out or anything else. But if my prediction is right and Clemson goes 8-4 for the second regular season in a row and loses their bowl game, that would be 5 losses. Trajectory. This is your trajectory. Down, 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 down. Not up. Have a good morning.